I've watched a lot of woodworking videos on YouTube, and I've noticed that most people appreciate when a person shows their mistakes instead of trying to hide them. If you're one of those people, you are in luck. I've got plenty in this build. But the point of this video isn't the mistakes, it's about learning from those mistakes and persevering to finish the project. So come check out how I took some old nail-filled timber from a barn and turned it into a round coffee table. First things first, let's get the van out of the garage so I can have all this space I need for the important work that is about to happen. Well, maybe I was having a little bit too much fun because I made my first mistake before I even decided to make a coffee table. I was originally planning to use this wood to make a countertop for a small cabinet, and after I cut my first piece to rough length, I thought to myself, that 4-foot piece of wood seems very short, and it was. It was just over 3 feet long. You've all heard the expression, measure twice, cut once. I measured once, cut in the wrong place, and ruined the project before it began. But the build must go on, and this is when I decided I didn't want to use this wood for a countertop anyways. I wanted to use it to build a round coffee table. And so that is when this project really began. I knew I wanted to cut this beam into thinner boards for the coffee table, and I chose to cut through the board in its thickest orientation. This is an attempt to avoid any nails that might still be hidden inside these old beams. There may be some foreshadowing in this line. Once I began to cut through the beam in this way, I realized I had a problem. Even when I flipped the beam and went from both sides, my saw blade wasn't large enough to cut all the way through. I solved this problem by using an axe head as a wedge to split the wood apart, but this led to some uneven texture on the faces of the wood and some tear out that I would have to deal with later. I hesitated with the second beam because it had a lot more nails to begin with, and I didn't know how deep the nails went and if there would be any inside that I couldn't see that I would hit with my saw blade. But I need a new saw blade anyway, so I decided to risk it. I cut on the line from the top on one side, then I flipped it over, came from the other side, leaving just that thin strip in the middle. Again, I used an axe head to separate the pieces, but this time there was a lot more resistance. And when I finally got the pieces apart, I understood why. Right in that thin strip between where the saw curves met, there was a single nail sticking through the wood. I missed it from the top and from the bottom. I mean, what are the chances that a nail would be right in the only place where my blade didn't touch it? I was pretty excited. But then I looked closer and realized that even though I had missed that nail, I had hit a whole bunch of other ones. You can see them here, 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 and yeah, you get the picture. Too bad for my saw blade, but now that I could see the nails, I got to work removing them. I took that one big nail out that was sticking out and used that like a nail punch with a hammer to punch out the other nails. I'll let you guess what happens next. Let's see that a few more times in slow motion. I switched to a file, which felt a little bit safer and easier to handle, and eventually got all the nails out of the wood. After I cut a third beam and got to where the other pieces were, I started preparing the pieces to be glued together. I put each board in the vise on both sides and edge plane them. When you do this, you're using the flat surface of the bottom of the plane to make the edge of the wood flat and smooth so that you'll have a good glue joint with plenty of contact between the edges. Here I'm using a number 6 Stanley plane, which works well for this type of application. This particular plane is over 100 years old, which is really fun to think about. I often think about who might have bought this plane new and how many projects it's been part of over the years, where it's traveled. So it's just kind of neat having this in my collection. Once all the sides were edge planed, I got ready to glue the panel together. I was going to make this table into a circle, so because the width of the panel was 31 inches, I knew I could cut it down to the same length. I cut off the excess length on some of the pieces to make it easier to glue and to hold the clamps. I put the pieces in the clamps and struggled to keep everything flat. I changed the configuration of the clamps, and then when one of the clamps came undone, I changed the pressure on the different clamps, and finally I just ended up jumping on the board in the middle to try to flatten them out. My plan was to use a hand plane to flatten the table after the glue up anyways, but because it didn't glue particularly flat, I gave myself some extra work here. After the panel was dry, I got it out of the clamps and onto my workbench. I started planing down the high spots, and this took a lot more effort than I'm showing here, but I must say that I do enjoy using a hand plane for this type of work. One of the challenges with this part of the project was the size of the panel compared to the size of my bench. I tried to do a few different things to make this workable. I clamped a board at the end of my bench to use as a stop, then I rotated the wood as necessary to get every spot I needed to. Sometimes I pushed the plane, sometimes I pulled it. I tried to work with the grain as much as possible, but there were times I didn't go with the grain and the wood tore out, which created little gouges, which was something I could have avoided with more care and made things more difficult later on. Once the table was relatively flat with all the high and low spots removed, I drew the circle shape of the table on the panel. For this part, I got an idea of using a piece of wood as a compass of sorts. I put a small nail through one side, then I drilled a hole on the other side where I could insert a Sharpie marker. I made the hole just a little bit smaller than the thickest part of the Sharpie, that way I could stick the Sharpie partway through in a way that would hold fast. I wanted the circle to be as big as possible given the size of the panel, and so I found the middle point of the piece of wood and carefully placed a nail on that spot. I did a test making a circle with the lid on, and I found out that the nail and Sharpie were just a little bit too far apart. At first I couldn't figure out how to move the Sharpie hole over because of how big the hole was, but then I realized I could just move the nail over a little bit, and that's what I did. I did another test, and this time it worked fine, so I removed the cap and drew the circle. I gotta say, there's something satisfying about how perfect the circle is when you draw it with this method. Now, to remove that extra material, I thought about using a jigsaw to cut out the shape, but I've noticed that when I use jigsaws, the angle of the cut is often skewed towards the bottom, especially with thicker material. I looked up online whether I could use my circular saw for this, if I could cut a curve with that. And one of my favorite answers was a person who said, "Of course you can. You cut curved lines all the time when you're trying to cut straight lines freehand." And that was pretty much all the encouragement I needed. I made a bunch of straight line cuts to remove the bulk of the material, and I made a round cut with my circular saw, which did a fairly good job. I left the line showing a little bit so that afterwards I can come and use my sander, come right up to that line so everything would be very uniformed. I would have loved to have a belt sander for this part, but since I don't have one, my random orbital sander would have to do. Once I got the sides close to the line in a uniform manner, I put the table on my bench to sand the top. Looking at the nail hole marks and some of the places I got tear out from the hand plane, I decided I would be okay with this table having a more distressed industrial look. Given the wood I used to make this, I think that makes sense too. I worked through the grits of sandpaper, knocking off any rough spots. I even sanded the bottom a little bit. And once it was sanded to a level I was comfortable with, I applied a stain. After that dried, I added several layers of polyurethane to give this table some much needed protection. And after that, it was putting the legs on. And for this, I bought some hairpin legs off Amazon. They were straightforward to install. The only trick was figuring out how far to install them from the edge of the table. Once they were at a place I thought looked nice, and once they were attached, this table was ready to come inside and to be put to use in our family room. So there you have it, some old barn beams transform into a round coffee table for the living room. If you like this video, go ahead and like it, subscribe if you want to, leave a comment, that's always helpful. Until next time, take care.